Okie dokie. I trust that every one of you can hear me well because I've been talking here and there for the last 30 minutes. And today I want to talk to you about worship and how we ought to worship and the significance of worship, especially in a time when there are so many racism, injustice, and upheavals. And there are things that seems to be so large and beyond our control, yet we want to respond and we kind of feel lost as to how we can respond to those things. So I don't have all the answers for you, and I don't have one thing where we can all do at the end of the sermon, but I do want us to imagine responding to the trials and difficulties and injustice in the world through the perspective of worship and through the lens of God. Now, when we come to worship, more often than not, what has ended up happening is that we became spectators of worship. In other words, we come to church on Sunday and we watch worship and we look at it. And of course, if you are spectating something that is before you, what you're looking for is something spectacular. So you want to be wowed and you want to be inspired and you want to be moved. And to be honest, me too. I like seamless worship. I like hearing great message. I like to see a worship team that is passionate. And I just like to see a tidy environment where I worship. And those things are not all bad at all. But when we have to ask ourselves, especially now, because we are watching and participating in Sunday worship through a screen. And it's very reminiscent, or it is very similar to watching Netflix or YouTube on our screen. And the question does pop into my head, which is, what is the difference between worship and a spectator? How do I know that I'm actually worshiping God or I am spectating the worship that is happening before me? And I think the biggest distinction that we have between spectating or becoming the end of worship, does the main activity of worship, is the main activity of worship done when you log off and close the screen, or are you actually sent out into the world so that you may live out and participate in the worship of God in the place that you live? So in other words, when I go watch a baseball, which isn't often, but when I do go or have gone, after the baseball game is over, after I spectate and I'm the spectator of that sport, I leave all that game behind the gates, and I just walk out and I'm done. I don't play baseball. I don't follow Blue Jays. I don't even like baseball, but I just sometimes like watching it at the stadium. Is your worship kind of like that, where what you have witnessed gets left behind? All the activities, God activities and worship is done and finished once you get up and you're done? Or does the Sunday corporate worship make you go out and live your life differently and see the world differently? And that is the major distinction. At the end of our worship, we have a section where we say you're sent to the world, that you're not just dismissed, but you are sent out into the world so that you may respond to God in the way that He has called you. So I think worship is, in some ways, is like a door where you walk out and you begin to respond to the things that you see. And you begin to respond to everything that you have heard. And you begin to respond to the things that are true to you. So today we're talking about the building of tabernacle. so that Israelites may worship in the desert. But then I ask myself this question: is that really the priority for people who are wandering in the desert? Aren't there other priorities that takes precedence over building a worship place? Couldn't that wait a little bit longer? And once they get into the promised land, that they can build something better, permanent, and they have time and energy to invest in worship. Why not train people how to fight a war? Why not teach them how to defend themselves against invaders and intruders and other nations, which is just surrounding them in the wilderness? What about some tips on how to build a shelter or get food or how to hunt? There are real priorities that Israelites had in the wilderness, but God chooses to teach them how to build a tabernacle. Tabernacle is really a fancy word for a tent. It's a makeshift tent where people worship God. And really, it just is a tent where people can pitch anywhere. And at the end, when worship is over, they can pack it up, just like when you go camping, and they carry it and go somewhere else and they worship once again. Tabernacle, today's reading was very simplified, but if you read the entire story of how to build a tabernacle, it's one of those parts of the Bible where you just kind of gloss over or skip over, because there's so many details. What kind of skin, what kind of wood, how many of this, how many of that, size of this, size of that. And it gets really super boring, because how to build a tabernacle is actually repeated twice in chapter 20s and then also 30s. So then when we look at worship, we think, well, worship is boring, worship is tedious, and worship is too detailed. So it's good enough that I worship at church and I just leave it there and I just go on with my life, go on with more important things of my life, more pressing things of my life, rather than think about, how do I worship God now that I've walked through the doors of the church? How do I respond to him? There is, I want you to see tabernacle not as simply details of this and that, but I want you to see the design of the tabernacle and how it mimics human body and human senses. And I will share with you how those human body and human senses are significant to the way that we worship God in our world, especially seeing all the injustice and racism and the global pandemic that is before us. First of all, tabernacle is a place where all of our senses come alive. There's an outer court, and inside the outer court, there's a smaller tent that resides, that lives inside those outer tents. And inside of that, what you find is a lamp, which signifies sight, therefore eyes. And there's table of bread, which signifies the mouth and tasting and eating. And there's altar of incense, which signifies smell, which goes back to your nose. And priests wore bells on the bottom of their robe, so there is a sense of hearing, which is attached to your ears. And of course, the tent of meeting is covered in 10 scraps or 10 sections of tent, and which signifies 10 digits of your fingers. And there's a skin, a ram skin that covers it, just like we have skin over our body. The way that pagan worship is designed, in contrast, is that pagans worship what they see and what they want to see. However, in the tabernacle, God gives worship to himself and teaches how to worship God who is unseen. Now, what are some of the significance of tabernacle mimicking the senses of human beings? The touch, hearing, the sight, and smell, and tasting. When you entered into the tent of meeting, there was no light other than the light that was provided by the lamp, and that provided sight, and it allowed you to see. When we go out into the world, how do you use your eyes? What does your eyes see? And what do you gaze upon? When you look at 10 Commandments, it says, do not covet. Do not covet what you see. Do not make idols from the things that you see. As we go out into the world today, what are some of the things that you see in the world, that you see and observe in the newspaper and whatever sources of news that you are exposed to? How does that lead you to worship God? What is your perspective when you see all the injustice and racism in the world? You see, worshiping God is not just something that you do at church, but it's to take your senses out into the world, and you are to employ what you see and turn that into worship. When you are eating bread from the table of bread, you are faced to ask the question, do I trust in God to give me sustenance? Or do I steal or do I murder to get what I want so that I will get ahead of life? Was there injustice associated with the grain that made this bread? Did I hoard all the grain for myself? Or did I leave some of the grains to be distributed by the poor and the strangers so that there's justice, so that I'm being a blessing to people? So table of bread revealed the justice and the way that you trusted in God so that you would not murder, so that you would not steal. And as you participated in that kind of lifestyle, that was how you honor God and how you worship God in your life. So you must use the senses of your mouth and what you taste and bring that out into the world as a way to worship God. And there was altar of incense, which you offered a prayer. And you burned the incense so that the smell would rise to the heavens. And that what your prayer is being offered to God, and it rises up to heaven. And what is the significance of the altar of incense? Sometimes when we look at all the violence and racism and all the deaths in the world, we feel like God is not present with us. That somehow we are in the dark and it seems like God is not doing anything. Just like the smell cannot be seen, the incense reminded the worshipers that God is still present with you. Sometimes I don't cook breakfast anymore for kids. And I just simply tell them, look in the fridge, look in the cabinet, fix yourself breakfast. But sometimes when I'm in a generous mood or I had 2 cups of coffee back to back, and I feel like maybe I should cook breakfast and I'm making something. As kids come downstairs, they say, what are you cooking? But they don't see me cooking. They don't know that I am cooking something, but they smell something as they come out of their room and make their way downstairs. So the incense reminded them, although you don't see justice flowing in the world, and although you don't see God doing something and you don't see, life is not spectacular, trust that in your prayer, God is present and God sees everything. God hears everything, and he is concerned. And he will roll out justice in the world, and he is inviting us. So we ask today, as we worship God, as we go out and honor God, and we say we are worshipers, how does our senses get used? What is it that you see? What discourages you and takes away your faith? And what makes you hopeless in the world? I guess what I am proposing now is that you and I put on the perspective of God and look how Christ hung out with the oppressed and the marginalized, and how he was criticized for eating and drinking with sinners of his time, and how he was involved with injustice and the suffering of the world by utilizing all of his senses, eating and drinking with him. Did he not also say, I can do only what I see my Father is doing in the world? That his sights and what he saw in the world was sharpened and focused through the scripture and what God was doing in the world. Jesus said to his disciples, "Blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear." So the question that we have as worshiper is, am I just a spectator, or do I employ all the senses that I have and worship and honor God and participate in redeeming the injustice and brokenness in the world? Do I see the world in the way that God sees the world? Do I hear the things as God hears the things? Do I hear the cries of those who fell victims and who are suffering today? Or do I simply hear the things that gives me pleasure and I can just shut out the things that I do not want to hear? I think it's important that we eat and drink and we become part in the lives of those who are suffering today. There are many people who are that are in the need of your fellowship, and we can always visit and see the lonely, and we can always see those who are isolated, and we can hand out the things that they need and be present in the lives of those who are broken. Let us not spectate any longer, but let us figure out a way where our life is literally worship, because we are surrendering our senses so that it would honor God, so that we can love God and love our neighbors as ourselves. Let us hear what God has to say through the things that we hear in the world. And let us use every day as a way to enter into the spirituality and discipleship that God is calling us. Worship is powerful because it encompasses everything that you and I see and hear, taste and touch and eat. Let's not leave worship behind the doors of the church, and that when we leave church, we simply live our lives. Worship doesn't end when we close our laptops and we just simply live our life that is completely different from how we have worshiped. But in many ways, worship continues because God has made the church into the body of Christ so that we may hear and see and touch and go to places where Christ has gone before us. And we may eat with those that that Christ has eaten with. And we may see the things that Christ has seen. and we may address the things that Christ has addressed. So when we live our life like that, we are living our life in worship, and we're glorifying God. And also, this is just the way that disciples live their life. So I invite you, as you worship God, that you will use all of your senses in everyday life so that your life is one whole worship to God.